You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis. In just over a fortnight, the greatest multi-sport spectacle of them all comes to London. The 2012 Olympics have been welcomed by the government not just as a celebration of sporting excellence, but also as a way of regenerating East London, boosting the national economy, and rekindling the nation's enthusiasm for sport. But even as the Games draw closer, there's been a barrage of criticism. They're too commercial, critics say, with companies like McDonald's and Coca-Cola demanding preferential treatment for sponsoring the Games. They'll also be heavily militarised, with 13,500 soldiers deployed, along with 40,000 private security guards. And for many Londoners, there'll be a Games that disrupts their daily lives, with transport networks overloaded and Olympic officials zooming past in special car lanes. To discuss the issues surrounding London 2012, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Ian McGrory of the University of East London. He's the co-editor of Olympic Cities 2012 and the Remaking of London. Mihir Bose, one of Britain's most eminent sports writers, and the author of The Spirit of the Game, How Sport Made the Modern World. John Goodbody will be covering the London Olympics for the Sunday Times. It'll be his 12th successive Games. And down the line from Prague, we're joined by Dr. Jim Parry. He's Professor of the Philosophy of Sport at Charles University in the Czech capital. If I might start with you, Mihir Bose, London 2012 would seem to be a long way from the Corinthian ideals that prompted the establishment of the Olympics.
Oh yes, this is a McDonald franchise operation. The IOC is like the Vatican of sport. It doesn't have any army, it doesn't have any territory, but when it signs up for the Games with the host city, it signs a contract. And the city has to provide what is called a clean city. This has happened after several recent games, particularly Atlanta. They've strengthened and tightened the regulations up. And clean city means that all the holdings around London, surrounding the Games and many other parts, have to ensure that there are no advertisements by companies which are commercial rivals of the Olympic sponsors. So the Olympics do a very, very interesting thing. Round the Games, when you show the Games, when people go to the venues or on television, there'll be no advertisements. And they'll be very tightly controlled, the logos on athletes and so on. But at the same time, there's a lot of money required to host the Games, and that money has to be ensured so that that is protected and there's no ambush marketing. So this is a very, very commercial operation that is coming to London.
John Goodbody, is it just about money nowadays, these Games, or are we being a little curmudgeonly?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think if you talk to the individual athletes themselves, they recognise that a lot of the money that is raised actually filters down to them, because the vast money that is now generated by the International Olympic Committee, I mean, you just have to look at the television money which has been agreed for the next two Olympics, which is over $3 billion US dollars for the United States, and we're already up to nearly $1 billion for Europe, for the European countries. That money comes down to them, to some of the lesser countries. Huge amounts of money are given to Olympic solidarity. For instance, about $40 million is given to Olympic solidarity, is money given to the international federations. And for the individual competitors, the great atmosphere of the Olympic Games, the great ambition of the Olympic Games, not only inspires the competitors themselves who are competing, but large numbers of other people up and down the country who go out training every day. I mean, even someone like me who went swimming at 6 o'clock this morning, as I do every morning, I'm inspired by the Olympic Games. I'm not going to compete in them, I'm reporting them, but I'm inspired by the ideal of them.
Well, to go back to your point about the money, you're saying that 40 million will go to the Solidarity Fund for Poor Nations. That does seem a bit sort of a drop in the ocean. These Games are going to cost almost £10 billion.
No, because, of course, it's putting that money, is putting on the Games costs £9 billion. The IOC makes a lot of money out of the Games, but they only retain less than 10%. The rest of the money goes to the National Olympic Committees of the various countries and to the international federations whose competitors take part in the Games themselves.
Professor Ian McGrory, we're already talking about money about these Games, about what they'll cost, how much they might sort of help some people or otherwise. Is this what the Games has become? It's about money, fundamentally.
Well, I think become is the important word, because the Games' capacity to inspire, which John has mentioned, for example, is rooted in part, at least, in the history of the Games. And of course, the Olympic Games, the modern Olympic Games, the 2012 Games, they have a history both in a sort of mythic connection to the ritual games of the past, which seems very non-commercial and very almost quasi-religious in its origins. So money was definitely to the side of that of major concerns in relation to the kind of myth of the ancient Olympics. And at the same time, also the 20th century Olympics, the modern Olympics, has had a kind of very schizophrenic relationship to money throughout the century. On the one hand, it's kept amateurism at the heart of the ideal of the Olympics, while also out of necessity in more recent decades having to dance a rather tricky dance with the commercialisation brought in by sponsors.
Professor Parry, are there underlying issues now about the games, about money and how much they impact on modern sport?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I'm not worried too much about the economic base of doing anything. I mean, if you want to if you want to support a church or a youth club, or if you want to have a school system, you need money in order to do it, and that's got to be financed one way or another. The ancient Olympic Games were financed by tributes from the participating nation states. Athletes at the ancient games, although they just won a laurel wreath, an olive wreath at the games themselves, were nevertheless rewarded when they returned home with quite substantial pensions and so on from their city-states. So money's always been part of it and always has to be part of any worthwhile enterprise. The question is, where does the money come from, and does it conflict with values that the organisation might have?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and I'm Howell Davis. And today we're discussing the Olympics in London in 2012. Have they become too commercial, or will they be a celebration of sporting excellence? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Professor Ian McCrory of the University of East London, Mihir Bose, one of Britain's most eminent sports writers, John Godbody, who's covered 11 successive summer games for the Times and will be covering this year's games for the Sunday Times. And down the line from Prague, we're joined by Dr. Jim Parry, Professor of Philosophy of Sport at Charles University in Prague. Ian McCrory, are we perhaps freighting games with too much significance here then?
Well, I think the Olympics probably are important as not only a sporting event, but also a symbolic event for some of the reasons that Mihir has mentioned, both on a global scale for the countries that have the spotlight that the Olympic brings for them and the opportunity to remake themselves and rebrand themselves, but also on the local level for a city to, in the best sense, come alive around a large festival. And I think that maybe is an important reminder, actually, that the Games is a sporting event, but it's also a festival. So some of the kind of moral framework which comes around sport, which is about a certain kind of discipline and a certain kind of commitment to amateurism and ideals of that kind, should also be recognised as taking place alongside an event which is actually a festival, an enjoyment, an engagement across the city and across activities which go far beyond sport.
John Godbody, is that one of the reasons you're attacking the critics, is because they're not seeing enough of the festival aspect of it? They're not taking enough enjoyment out of the games?
Yes, I partly feel that, but I also feel that, as Mihir has rightly pointed out, I mean, the money is particularly high for a host city because you are putting on you're putting up a theatre to all intents and purposes in East London. And what you've got to remember is that the reason that Ken Livingstone was so keen to have the Olympics originally was not because he actually wanted to have the Games, but he wanted to regenerate an area of London which I know fairly well because I live near there, work near there, and what he has been created is going to be a huge park with certain sports facilities of which we have considerable need in the country, one of them being a 50-metre pool, because we've got a shortage of 50-metre pools in London. We've only got 3 50-metre pools before we have these Olympic facilities that we're going to have, together with the other facilities together, and that has helped. The Games have been a catalyst. You've only got to go, as I did last week, through Westfield, this enormous shopping centre with lots of people there, people working in those shops, to see that has happened because the Olympics are going to be next door.
Mihir Bose, this cost the government a lot of money. Could there be other ways of regenerating the East End, do you think, apart from sport?
Well, that is the point. Other than sport, Ken Livingstone wouldn't have got the money he wanted. And also, the Olympics does another thing, and this has been a very clever move by the IOC. It if you like, says when the starting gun will be fired. So from the moment London won the Games to the moment the opening ceremony is staged is 7 years. So you know the time scale. Now you look at other projects like expanding Heathrow. How long has that debate been going on? Or you look at other projects like Wembley. If you don't have a starting point, you can't postpone the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. You've got to hold it. So therefore, the country investing does know that there is a final point where the investment has to stop, the whole thing has to be staged. And nothing else in the world provides that. My only argument with the modern Olympic Games and the way they have been refashioned since the Los Angeles Games of 1984 and money coming in is that I wish the Olympic authorities would accept that they are really running a corporate state, instead of trying to pretend that it is still the games of Pierre Coubertin. And Pierre Coubertin himself didn't care for amateurism when he held the first Congress. It's very interesting, which kick-started the modern games. He said this was about amateurism, and then later on in his memoirs he said, no, it's not about amateurism. I don't care if the athletes get a 5-franc coin. Of course, in those days a 5-franc coin was a lot of money. The modern athletes will get a lot more. I think if they could be a bit more open, then the sort of criticism that you mentioned about Olympic lanes and so on, which are necessary in a modern city, particularly in London with its transport problems, if they were a bit more open and say, yes, this is a corporate entity that is coming. We still have some great ideas, and the magic of the games can still be there once the competition starts, but let's not pretend that this is not a commercial enterprise that is coming to another country and is being hosted by that country for certain reasons.
These Olympic lanes, these seem to be the sort of real focus for criticism.
Yes, because I think particularly in this country, which has such strong memories of 1948, where the athletes were given a free cup of Bovril and the male athletes were given Y-fronts at the end of it, that idea of why do you need Olympic lanes, and I think there's a very strong still minority, and particularly led by thinkers in this country, who see the Olympics as a waste of time and who see this as a recreation of the old Soviet Union, and the old Eastern Bloc and all those sort of trappings of power. And I think that has not been sufficiently explained, if you like, that is necessary if for instance, the athletes who are trying to get to the 100 metres are not late, as they once were in 1916 Rome.
Ian McCrory, going back to the regeneration of London, do you think they could have done this a different way, or was it necessary for the Games to be held for East London to be recreated?
Well, I think it's important to remember that East London is always being recreated and it's always being regenerated. You only have to look at the Canary Wharf development, which obviously took place independently of any thinking and long in advance of any thinking around the Olympic Games, to see that recovering the industrial land of East London has been a 50-year project going back, and not just a 7-year project in the way that Olympic regeneration is. But I think the Olympics does provide that all-important kind of framing narrative for accelerating a concerted, wide-ranging plan. It's extremely difficult for local authorities to think on a kind of longitudinal scale, but also across their own borders. The Olympics has had the advantage of forcing a number of boroughs and across London to think spatially in larger segments, and I think that's been an important contribution to regenerating the space of the Olympics. But I would disagree that the Olympics is in any way an end point to the regeneration or indeed to the money. I think it's very important, actually, that for the legacy, which is another important aspect of this debate, is understood as an ongoing project.
Jim Goodbody, we have had criticism of previous Olympic Games that they haven't actually left a legacy. Do you think this will be the case in London, or have we managed to sort of sort it out this time?
I think we've done it better than most previous Olympic cities in certainly the last 20 years. I mean, the fact is that if I can take up Ian's point there, there are certain things that have been done at these Olympic Games. To give you one example, the Olympic Village. Now, that Olympic Village is going to allow people to live in East London. 10,000 people, something like that, will be able to live in that Olympic Village for the next 50, possibly 100 years. There's that. Then you've got a lovely new park. That is something that I think in that area was needed. And there was contaminated ground there. I mean, that was why it was so complicated at the start, because they had to decontaminate the ground.
Mihir Bose is trying to get in, I think.
Well, no, it's always said about the Olympics that you have a long sunrise and a very short sunset, because no games, apart possibly from Barcelona, has left a legacy. London did start early, but we must recognise that London also promised something that no other games has promised. If you see that London video in Singapore, which was crucial in winning the vote, it started with Soweto, boys in Soweto throwing stones and seeing scenes from London games, and then stopping throwing stones and taking to sport. So there is that international commitment. We'll have to see if it works. And I think the London Games in the end will be judged by what happens to the main Olympic Stadium. And at the moment, the post-used games of the Olympic Stadium is very much in doubt.
Jim Parry, are you optimistic there'll be a lasting legacy?
Yes, I'm certain there'll be a lasting legacy in infrastructural terms, but I think we have to distinguish between infrastructural investment, in which obviously the government has a tremendous interest, and the role of the Olympics in motivating that interest. Mihir Bose's point is well made. There's a motivational effect of the Olympic Games and a focusing effect of the Olympic Games because of the time scale imposed. But that's quite different from the cost of the games themselves and how that's financed through commercialism. So infrastructural development is one thing, and the commercialisation of the Olympic Games is another, I think.
Is there also a problem in that the British actually seem to be quite cynical about these games? There's statistics showing that 49% of people in London and 53% in the rest of the country are just not interested in the games. Dr. Parry?
Yes, but that's 50% of people who are. and if you ask how many people are interested in politics or religion or some program on the TV, it's going to be less than 50%.
I was going to say that we have in this country a very strong minority of intellectuals who are hostile to the games. In previous games as well that I have covered, you often have the cities, when you arrive there, there's still a feeling that, the games will not work. And then the cities are dressed up in the Olympic colours and as they say, and London is being transformed as we speak. But there isn't, if you like, that strong intellectual minority which are opposed to the games. London still has that. And they will, if you like, represent the 49 or 50% or articulate those views and fears that the Olympic Games are not worth having.
So you think that over the coming weeks or the coming 2 weeks, people will get more enthusiastic about the Games?
I think they will. Once they see the city being transformed, how the Games are being held, and hopefully the first Saturday there's a British the medal winner, the whole thing will be transformed, and a wave of enthusiasm, the Olympic magic, as it were, which is what the Games organisers talk about, will, I think, take effect. But only for those few weeks.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and I'm Howell Davis. And today we're discussing the Olympics in London in 2012. Have they become too commercial, or will they be a celebration of sporting excellence? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Professor Ian McCrory of the University of East London, Mihir Bose, one of Britain's most eminent sports writers, John Goodbody, who's covered 11 successive summer games for the Times and will be covering this year's games for the Sunday Times. And down the line from Prague, we're joined by Dr. Jim Parry, Professor of Philosophy of Sport at Charles University in Prague. John Goodbody, can I just make the point to you that there may be this wave of enthusiasm still to come, but one of the problems is that this is being organised by the IOC, and the British are very cynical about the IOC.
Yes, I think they are. They certainly have been in the past for various reasons. But I think one thing you've got to realise about these games is that we've had a very, very smooth build-up so far. I mean, we're nearly there. We've got a fortnight to go. I mean, the Minister for Sport actually cleared his diary for June and July because they were fearful that something was going to happen. And nothing has happened. You go back to talk to Australians in Sydney, and that people were very much anti the Olympics until the torch arrived, and then it took off. Well, we weren't anti it until, and the torch has been, phenomenally successful around the country. In Athens in 2004, there was huge opposition and huge problems, financial, and whether the games were actually going to get staged.
Well, that's one of the worries, is that we'll end up with a legacy like Athens, where they have decaying stadiums that nobody wants. So.
Yes, I think it's a different situation. Don't forget, Athens has got is a country of only of 8 to 10 million people. We're a country of 60 million people, and it's in a massive metropolis like London. And the facilities that are up will, the actual concrete facilities, will be of benefit for generations. I mean, the whole question of the main stadium, we can go on. We can have a 2-hour discussion about. That's something separate, but. The other areas of legacy, the other facilities will be of use. Cycling, it's become enormously popular in Britain now. There's going to be a new cycling stadium.
Ian McCrory, this Games is trying to aim to be another Barcelona or another Sydney, perhaps, as opposed to the Athens, which seems to be the flag wave of a failure as the Olympics. Which one do you think we're aiming for? Which one do you think we're actually going to succeed at?
I think the Barcelona is the most commonly made comparison. I think the important difference is that Barcelona actually did it not by talking about Olympic legacy and not by subscribing to the idea of mega events like the Olympics working as urban transformation schemes, but just by doing it. The concept of legacy wasn't really talked about in relation to the Olympics until the Barcelona Games were well and truly over. What Barcelona successfully did was tag the Olympics onto a much broader and a much deeper and longer term set of changes. It added momentum and it added energy to something which was already in train. I think that's an important framework for thinking about the change in East London too. If people are going to ask the Olympics to be a magic bullet to transform the whole of the east of London in a short space of time, they will be disappointed.
I think we should recognise that London carries a very heavy burden. It's the only city that will have hosted 3 Olympics, and it's very possible, given the economic times we're in, that a major industrial country will not host the Olympics for a long time. Rome, for instance, backed out of bidding for the 2020 Olympics because with other emerging countries coming up and their economies are not doing as badly as the Western economies are doing, they will want to stage the game. So if you like, London has a special burden to show.
John Goodbody, you're nodding your head in agreement.
Yes, I mean, I would agree there. I mean, the fact is that through commercialism, through the long presidency of Juan Antonio Samaranch, the whole change in the Olympic movement has been quite dramatic. It's got to be remembered that when Los Angeles got the Games in 1984, it was the only city bidding for the Games. Now, here we are in 2012, and we won it against 4 other major cities, all of whom were trying to get it, because it's recognised that there is a belief which I subscribe to, that in fact, getting the Games is of benefit to the country, and it's only because of the commercialism that was introduced by the former president that has allowed the Games to have this very sound financial background.
But isn't it sort of like a chicken and the egg situation in that you have bigger and bigger games, so you need to get more and more money? If they scale down the Games, for example, they need less money and less commercialisation.
Yes, I mean, you could scale down the Olympics. I mean, I've always been in favour of moving some of the indoor sports to the Winter Games because, but I haven't been able to sway the IOC on this, I mean, there are certain sports in the Olympics, boxing, weightlifting, wrestling, judo, gymnastics even, which could be quite easily accommodated by the host city of the Winter Games, thereby bolstering up the Winter Games, which was quite sensibly changed from being in the same year as the Summer Games to the even year between the Summer Games, because all you need really is a big indoor arena of some sort, and most cities have that, which would stage a Winter Olympics.
But you see, modern Olympics are driven by television, which is why golf is coming in, which is why rugby is coming in, which is why probably, who knows, someday cricket might come in.
But in these sports, you have your golf, for example, it'll be a sideshow to the majors taking place there. Surely it'll be less important. It's not the main thing in their sport.
Yeah, but individual athletes, for instance, Roger Federer, after winning Wimbledon, said he would love to win an Olympic gold,
Well, of course he'd love to win it, but I know. He'd rather win Wimbledon than a gold medal, I suspect.
Absolutely, but he goes away with a cheque, and that is what makes his money. So he has enough resources to not to worry about doing it. But actually, that I think, to a certain extent, what the Olympics is doing is presenting this facade. For instance, when the Olympics starts, Jack Rogge, the president of the IOC, will leave the Hilton at Park Lane and move into the Olympic Village. No other major sport event, no other sport event at all, has an Olympic village where all the participants stay. So if you like, that old image of Coubertin is still being preserved, and the Olympics get away with that, and they preserve it, and they see the rings as something very holy, something almost religious in the way that the founder of the modern Olympics wanted to. And that, if you like, is that special magic which they transmit. But they realize that if they don't have games that sell on television, they will not get the money from television rights. So, there's a bargain there that's going on all the time.
Jim Parry, they've got a special magic about them, the games. You think that's true?
Well, that's certainly true. But I'd just like to say a little word about legacy. I mean, I'm absolutely certain in my own mind that there will be a highly significant infrastructural legacy from the Olympic Games, a city infrastructural legacy. No doubt about that at all. I'm also certain that there'll be a significant sports infrastructural legacy. No doubt about that at all. But what else? That's hard legacy. What about the soft legacy? Will there be a sports participation legacy? Will sports participation generally in the UK increase? The jury's out on that one. What about the wider aims of the International Olympic Committee? It's supposed to be an organisation that sees the Olympic Games, and not just as a sporting event in its own right, but as an event that publicises an ideology which says that sport has a place in culture, society, and especially in education because of its ethical basis. Now, where's the legacy in terms of education? Where's the development of physical education in British schools? Where's the development of an idea of sport that's not just about competition and winning and so on, but also about participation?
But we can't get that unless you have state schools taking part in sports. Majority of the athletes who won for Britain in Beijing came from the private sector, were private sector educated.
That's my point. That is my point precisely. Why don't we get students from the state sector? It's because we don't have a decent physical education system that's motored by a government that believes in sport for everyone.
But that will require a generational change, and Olympics, will not change that.
Well, the Olympics should have tried to. That's my point. We should have used this in the way that the Chinese did. The Chinese educational system was remodeled. The whole moral education sector of the Chinese curriculum was modeled on ethical sport. The Greeks in the previous Olympics employed an extra 3,000 teachers to go into schools to promote Olympic education. On a 6-to-1 British scale, 60 million of us, 10 million of them, that's an extra 18,000 teachers in schools. The Greeks did that. What have we done?
I'm afraid we don't really have time for us to discuss that particular issue. But I might finally just close with John Goodbody, who's the most positive, I think, of all our contributors about the Games, perhaps unfairly to all the others, and just say, well, in 2 weeks' time, what are you really looking forward to most?
Well, personally, I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of great sport, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I think the public will embrace the event. I think the demand for tickets has been extraordinary. And I think that the vast number of people who will go to the Games will be inspired not only to take part themselves, but to become interested in all the Olympic sports, including football, including basketball and all the other international sports that are so popular.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it there. If I could just say thank you very much to our guests here today, Professor Ian McGrory of the University of East London, Mihir Bose, one of Britain's most eminent sports writers, John Goodbody, who will be covering the Olympics for the Sunday Times, and down the line from Prague, Dr. Jim Parry, Chair of the British Philosophy of Sport Association and visiting Professor of Philosophy at Charles University in the Czech capital. Thank you all very much indeed. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis. In just over a fortnight, the greatest multi-sport spectacle of them all comes to London. The 2012 Olympics have been welcomed by the government not just as a celebration of sporting excellence, but also as a way of regenerating East London, boosting the national economy, and rekindling the nation's enthusiasm for sport. But even as the games draw closer, there's been a barrage of criticism. They're too commercial, critics say, with companies like McDonald's and Coca-Cola demanding preferential treatment for sponsoring the games. They'll also be heavily militarised capital. If I might start with you, Mihir Bose, London 2012 would seem to be a long way from the Corinthian ideals that prompted the establishment of the Olympics.
Oh yes, this is a McDonald franchise operation. The IOC is like the Vatican of sport. It doesn't have any army, it doesn't have any territory, but when it signs up for the games with the host city, it signs a contract. And the city has to provide what is called a clean city. This has happened after several recent games, particularly Atlanta. They've strengthened and tightened the regulations up. And clean city means that all the holdings around London, surrounding the games and many other parts, have to ensure that there are no advertisements by companies which are commercial rivals of the Olympic sponsors. So the Olympics do a very, very interesting thing. Round the games, when you show the games, when people go to the venues or on television, there'll be no advertisements. And they'll be very tightly controlled, the logos on athletes and so on. But at the same time, there's a lot of money required to host the games, and that money has to be ensured so that that is protected and there's no ambush marketing. So this is a very, very commercial operation that is coming to London.
John Goodbody, is it just about money nowadays, these games, or are we being a little curmudgeonly?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think if you talk to the individual athletes themselves, they recognise that a lot of the money that is raised actually filters down to them, because the vast money that is now generated by the International Olympic Committee, I mean, you just have to look at the television money which has been agreed for the next two Olympics, which is over $3 billion US dollars for the United States, and we're already up to nearly $1 billion for Europe, for the European countries. That money comes down to them, to some of the lesser countries. Huge amounts of money are given to Olympic solidarity. For instance, about $40 million is given to Olympic solidarity. Is money given to the international federations, and for the individual competitors, the great atmosphere of the Olympic Games, the great ambition of.
With 13,500 soldiers deployed, along with 40,000 private security guards. And for many Londoners, there'll be a Games that disrupts their daily lives, with transport networks overloaded and Olympic officials zooming past in special car lanes. To discuss the issues surrounding London 2012, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Ian McGrory of the University of East London. He's the co-editor of Olympic Cities, 2012 and the Remaking of London. Mihir Bose, one of Britain's most eminent sports writers, and the author of The Spirit of the Game, How Sport Made the Modern World. John Goodbody will be covering the London Olympics for the Sunday Times. It'll be his 12th successive games. And down the line from Prague, we're joined by Dr. Jim Parry. He's Professor of the Philosophy of Sport at Charles University in the Czech capital.